His fist was still tangled in her hair when the sound of the door opening cut through the room. He didn't bother to look, completely missing the man in black who observed the scene in utter silence until a level voice asked, "Is that how you place your hands on my sister?" In that single moment, all his authority vanished. If this story has grabbed your attention, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the powerful stories still to come. I have another tale you will not forget dropping tomorrow. And before you go, please leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I truly enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's return to the scene. Three different walls in the apartment already had holes punched through them when Matteo Lambert, one of the most feared mafia bosses in southern Europe, entered the apartment. He found his sister's boyfriend, with her hair twisted tightly around his knuckles. Shards of broken glass still sparkled on the wooden floor where a mirror had been smashed. A low sound of weeping filled the space. It was Juliet, her face a mask of agony and shame. Her hands were clutched at her own head, a futile gesture to shield herself from the violence that was already happening. The man holding her was frozen in the middle of a shouted excuse, totally oblivious to the figure approaching him through his own home. Coffee Jones, standing at 6 feet and 2 inches tall with wide shoulders, wore a brown jacket over a dark red hoodie. He tightened his hold on the woman who had concealed the most dangerous part of her identity for 6 long years. His other hand was raised near her face. He had not struck her yet, but the possibility of a blow was a sharp presence in the air, a weapon poised to descend. The apartment seemed to shrink around them. The beige walls, the cream-colored couches, and the sunlight pouring through thin curtains made the space feel gentle, secure, and completely normal. It was anything but. Juliet's breathing was a series of quick, broken inhales. Her blue denim jacket was pulled crookedly across her body from her earlier struggles to get free. Strands of her dark hair were pasted to her tear-soaked cheeks. She had given up on pulling away from him, given up on trying to talk sense into him. Now, she was simply surviving it, her eyes clenched shut, just waiting for the ordeal to finally end. Coffee's voice sliced through the strained silence like a shard of glass. "Do you think I am an idiot? Do you honestly believe I cannot see what you are doing?" His grip became even tighter. Juliet let out a whimper, a noise so faint it was barely a human sound. "Answer me!" She could not respond. Her throat felt sealed shut, trapping the words inside. And it was then that the door swung inward. It did not fly open violently or with any drama. It simply opened. The man who came inside was dressed entirely in black. He wore tailored trousers, a dark shirt unbuttoned at the neck, and a long, dark coat that flowed around him as he moved. His hair was dark and styled with precision. His face was sharp and impossible to read, the kind of face that showed you nothing right before the end. He made no announcement, issued no shout, and did not charge into the room. He just stood there, his hand resting on the doorknob, and surveyed the scene with the detached, professional evaluation of a man who had seen much worse things and had lived to tell about them. Coffee's head jerked toward the unexpected guest. His face moved through a series of emotions in less than a second, from fury to confusion, and then to a hostile defensiveness. "Who in the hell are you? Is this how you touch my sister?" The question settled in the quiet room like a heavy stone dropped into a placid pond. Matteo's voice was low, almost like he was just making conversation, but there was a quality beneath it, a frigid and final tone that seemed to make the room's temperature fall by 10 degrees. Coffee just blinked. "What?" "My sister," Matteo repeated. His eyes, which were dark and held no trace of warmth, moved from Coffee to Juliet and then back to Coffee. "Is this the way you are supposed to touch her?" For a long second, no one moved at all. Juliet's eyes fluttered open. They were red and full of a new kind of horror. She stared at her brother, who was standing in the doorway like a specter from a life she had tried so hard to escape. "Matteo," she breathed. The name itself shattered the tension in the air. Coffee's hand loosened its grip on her hair just a little. His mind was struggling to connect too many things at once. This man. That name. The way Juliet had said it was filled with recognition, with shared history, and with absolute terror. I do not know who you believe you are, Coffee began, his voice trying to find its earlier hardness. But it is time for you to leave. This is a private matter between us. Mateo just inclined his head slightly. Coffee Emmanuel Jones, born on April 14, 1992, in Ara. Relocated to Geneva in 2019. You are currently working at Mercier Logistics as a supervisor in the warehouse. Your address is this apartment. The lease was signed 8 months ago. You opened a joint bank account with Juliet Lambert 6 months ago. There was a withdrawal of $3,200 last Tuesday. It was not authorized. Coffee became completely motionless. You have been attending sessions with Dr. Oe for anger management, Mateo went on, his voice perfectly level. You have missed your last 4 appointments. You had a police report filed against you in 2021 for assault. The charges were dropped after the witness changed their story. Do you want me to continue? The blood completely drained from Coffee's face. Juliet felt his hand finally go limp in her hair. She moved away from him with caution, backing up until she hit the couch, using one hand on the armrest to stay on her feet. Her legs were trembling uncontrollably. In fact, her entire body was shaking. Mateo's intense stare remained fixed on Coffee. Let me make what is happening right now perfectly clear, Mateo stated. He took a final step into the apartment and shut the door behind him, the latch making a soft click. You have just performed an act of violence on a person who is under my protection. This has now created a significant problem. I did not. She is not. Coffee's words came out in a stammer, all his earlier confidence dissolving like wet tissue. Listen, man, I am not sure what she has been telling you, but she did not tell me a thing. Mateo's voice was as precise as a surgeon's blade. She never does. That is precisely why I have people in place to watch, to make reports, and to inform me when behavioral patterns shift. Coffee's eyes quickly shot over to Juliet. She refused to meet his gaze. She could not. Juliet, Coffee pleaded, his tone changing into something that sounded almost like begging. Tell him. Just tell him this is all a big misunderstanding. She remained silent. Mateo took another step forward. He did not rush. Every movement was calculated and unhurried. He came to a stop about 3 feet away from Coffee. He was close enough to be an obvious menace, yet far enough away to appear calm. I am going to provide you with a single opportunity, Mateo said, to give me a reason why I should not make you vanish from this earth. The threat settled over the room like a tightening rope. Coffee's mouth opened, then snapped shut. His hands, the very same hands that had been so certain of their own strength just 60 seconds earlier, were now trembling by his sides. From her position across the room, Juliet watched the 2 separate lives she had led finally crash into one another. The new existence she had so carefully constructed and the old one she had desperately fled were now meeting in a terrible moment she had prayed for 6 years would never arrive. Mateo looked over at her for just a second, but it was long enough for him to notice the red marks forming on her wrists and the angry patches on her scalp. He saw the way she held her body, as if she were an object that was already shattered. When his eyes returned to Coffee, his face was unchanged, but the feeling in the room had shifted. It was now smaller, colder, and utterly final. Please, Coffee whispered. Mateo reached inside his coat, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. The call was answered on the very first ring. I am in need of a cleanup team, Mateo said into the phone, his voice low. It is a residential location. 1 removal. There are no complications. He disconnected the call, and then he simply stood there and waited. Juliet was only 9 years old the first time she watched her brother make someone disappear. He did not use his hands or a weapon. He used only a phone call. It was the same kind of call he had just made 60 seconds ago inside her apartment, while Coffee just stood there shaking. She had been hiding behind the heavy door of Mateo's study in their family home, a large villa just outside of Lyon that always smelled of antique wood and expensive tobacco. She was not supposed to be in there. She was not supposed to see anything. But children often find a way to observe the very things that adults try the hardest to keep hidden. Matteo was 23 years old back then, already managing significant parts of their father's business, already a man to be feared. The man who was kneeling before him had been weeping and begging, offering promises he would never get a chance to fulfill. Matteo had listened to all of it with the exact same look he had now, patient, detached, and final. After that, he made a phone call. And then, the man was simply gone. Juliet never brought it up or asked what had happened. She did not need to. You did not plead with Matteo Lambert for your life, and then get to leave and tell people about it. That night, as she lay in her bed, she made a promise to herself that would define the next 17 years of her existence. She vowed she would never be a person who required that sort of protection. She would never be the one who caused another person to kneel and plead for their life. She would simply cease to exist in that world. It took her until she was 18 to finally make it happen. Their father passed away when she was 15. A heart attack was the official story, but Juliet always thought that Matteo's rivals were more inventive with their methods than most people knew. Following the funeral, Matteo transformed from just her brother into something else entirely. He became a fortress standing between her and a world that was eager to consume anyone associated with the Lambert family name. He assigned her bodyguards she could never see but could always sense. He investigated her friends, her instructors, and the very routes she took to school. He managed every single detail because control was the only thing he really understood, and Juliet was suffocating beneath the weight of it all. The most difficult part was that she did not hate him. She loved him. She loved the older brother who had once read stories to her at bedtime before his responsibilities consumed him. She loved the man who never forgot her birthday, even while he was in the middle of negotiating agreements that shifted millions of dollars across international borders. But her love for him and her own freedom were two completely different things. So on a Tuesday morning in the month of March, just 3 weeks after she turned 18, Juliet Lambert left the villa carrying only a backpack, a counterfeit passport, and 30,000 euros she had been secretly saving since she was 14. She did not leave a note or say goodbye. She just left a void where she used to be. She was certain Matteo would search for her. She knew he possessed the means to locate her if he was truly determined. However, she also understood her brother's nature well enough to believe this. If she ran far enough and lived quietly enough, if she could become a complete nobody in a world that only paid attention to those with power, he might just decide to let her go. Not because he did not care, but because he would see her choice as its own kind of power. It was a paradox of protection, driven by both a lack of care and an excess of it. For 6 long years, Juliet had mastered the art of being unseen. She moved across the European continent like a phantom, a whisper in the alleys of Vienna, Prague, and Amsterdam, before settling in Geneva. She adopted new names, took jobs that paid in cash, and secured apartments through intermediaries. Her entire existence was designed to avoid surveillance, to sidestep inquiries, and to never raise a single red flag in the sophisticated systems she knew Matteo monitored. She embraced anonymity as a waitress, a clerk in a quiet bookstore, a dog walker, simple, forgettable roles where no one ever asked for a last name or questioned why she paid her rent 3 months up front in cash. She allowed herself a single friendship with a woman named Claire, a coworker at a cafe who was so consumed by her own daily dramas that she never probed into Juliet's past. This was freedom at its most desolate. There were nights Juliet would lie awake in those Spartan apartments, consumed by the question of whether Matteo knew her location. Was he observing from afar, permitting her charade of independence while silently neutralizing threats she would never even perceive? On other nights, she would tell herself he had forgotten her, that he was too busy expanding his empire to remember the little sister who had chosen an ordinary life over one defined by blood. Each possibility was a different kind of ache. She encountered Coffee on an October Sunday. He offered her a smile in a bookstore that was disarmingly easy, confident, and warm. A look that made her feel truly visible after so many years spent perfecting the art of disappearing. They found themselves discussing novels that neither had actually finished. He managed to make her laugh and asked for her number without any hint of pressure. Their first meeting for coffee stretched into dinner, which then melted into a long walk through Geneva as the city lights flickered on one by one. He was utterly charming and deeply attentive. He would ask about the small details of her day and genuinely listen to her responses. He never pushed for details when she spoke vaguely about her history. He never demanded to know why she had no online presence or why her wallet was always filled with cash instead of cards. For 3 incredible months, everything was perfect. For 3 months, Juliet permitted herself to believe that this was possible. She could possess something like this, a life that was normal, a life that was hers alone, a life completely separate from violence. But then the inquiries began, starting as small, almost unnoticeable probes. Why do you never mention your family? Where was it you said you were from? Why do you recoil any time I raise my voice? Soon after, the comments started. You are far too friendly with that man at your job. Why would you possibly need a separate bank account? I am only trying to keep you safe. And then came the control. He demanded to know her location at all times, the company she kept, the reason she was late. He questioned why she smiled at the barista and why she took more than 5 minutes to reply to his messages. The very first time he seized her wrist, he apologized almost instantly. He brought her flowers and swore it would never happen again. But it did happen, again and again. Every single instance was followed by a flood of apologies, a string of justifications, and renewed promises that if she could just stop making him so anxious, so envious, so furious, then it would all finally end. Juliet recognized this pattern. She had been educated by professional bodyguards. She was raised in a world of men who used violence as a primary form of communication. She understood the signs, she knew the terrifying escalation, and she saw exactly where this path was leading. Yet, leaving would involve answering questions. It would mean filing official reports. It would draw attention. To leave would be to make herself visible again. And visibility was the one luxury Juliet Lambert could not afford. And so, she remained. She learned to make herself smaller, to be quieter, to move with even greater caution. She cut off contact with Claire, she stopped visiting her favorite cafe, and she abandoned anything that could potentially ignite Coffee's explosive anger. She was surviving. She survived right up until tonight, until the moment Mateo strode through her door and witnessed the devastating toll that survival had taken. Now, standing in her own apartment as her brother placed the kind of phone call that made people vanish, Juliet felt the crushing weight of those 6 years condense into one awful certainty. You can flee from your bloodline, but your bloodline never forgets how to find you. Coffee Jones discovered at a young age that charm could secure anything that violence could not. His father had taught him this lesson, not with advice, but with his profound absence. The sort of absence that results from being incarcerated for using your hands on the wrong individual at the wrong moment. Coffee was only 12 years old when that prison term began. He was 16 when his father was finally released, a man made older and more bitter, now fiercely determined to impart the lesson he himself had learned far too late. Never allow them to witness you losing control. Control was a form of currency. Control was absolute power. Coffee had dedicated his entire adult life to mastering the performance of a man who never had to raise his voice, because everyone around him was already eager to do his bidding. This approach had worked flawlessly until he encountered someone who needed absolutely nothing from him. Juliet was different from the very start. The women Coffee typically pursued were transparent. They were looking for something: security, validation, status, or an escape from the turmoil of their own lives. He could identify that specific hunger in their eyes during the first conversation and would then adjust his strategy to match. But Juliet, She looked at him as if she was meticulously assessing whether he was even safe to be near. On that first afternoon in the bookstore, he had approached her with his usual method: casual self-assurance, a touch of self-deprecating humor, and just enough focused interest to appear sincere without coming across as desperate. She had offered a polite smile, given minimal answers to his questions, and had already started to turn away. He should have just let her walk. But instead, he changed his tactic, dropping the entire act and asking a sincere question about the book she was holding. It was some French novel he had been forced to read back in school. Her entire presence changed in that instant. She paused, began to speak, and actually made eye contact with him. In that moment, Coffee experienced a feeling he had not known for years. He felt as though he had earned a prize truly worth winning. The initial 3 months were the happiest of his entire life. Juliet was reserved, thoughtful, and cautious in a way that made each of her smiles feel like a genuine accomplishment. She never requested lavish dinners or insisted on weekend getaways. She was perfectly content with quiet walks, shared coffees, and conversations that drifted on until the city lights began to glow. She never once inquired about his work, his finances, or his ambitions for the future. She never looked through his phone or demanded to know where he had been. She simply did not need him, and that ultimately was the problem. Coffee had constructed his entire identity around the idea of being needed, of being the answer to someone else's troubles, the protector, the provider, the man who could step in and make things right. But Juliet did not require fixing. She had her own apartment, her own job, and her own painstakingly built life that operated entirely without him. She would smile, kiss him goodbye, and then vanish back into that separate world without a single glance over her shoulder. It left him feeling invisible, superfluous, and completely irrelevant. And Coffee Jones could not stand to be irrelevant. The change began so gradually that he barely registered it himself. A simple comment here, a probing question there. "Who is that you are talking to? Why do you have to work so late tonight? That man at the coffee shop was looking at you in a strange way." Juliet would just laugh it away. She would tell him he was seeing things that were not there. She would kiss him and steer the conversation elsewhere. But Coffee was not imagining things. He observed the way other men looked at her. So quiet, so pretty, so self-sufficient. He watched how she navigated the world as if she needed no one's approval or protection. He sometimes caught a deep distance in her eyes, a look that suggested she was recalling a past he was forbidden from knowing about. She was keeping secrets, and secrets were a clear sign that she did not trust him. And if she did not trust him, then what was the purpose of their relationship? His questions grew more frequent and far more pointed. He had to know her whereabouts, who she was with, and why she had not replied to his text message instantly. This was not because he mistrusted her, he would tell himself, but because he cared so deeply. Because caring meant paying close attention. Because how was he supposed to protect her if he was not aware of her every move? Juliet started answering more quickly. She began offering up information before he even had to ask. She started arriving home earlier and earlier. Her smile stretched wider, a desperate effort to demonstrate something that should never have required proof. As she did, Coffee felt the tension in his own shoulders ease. This felt better. This was correct. It was the way a partnership was meant to function. He could not recall the first time his hands closed around her. That was the most agonizing part of it all. Reflecting on it now, standing inside this very apartment with a stranger on the telephone arranging his quiet exit, Coffee could not identify the precise moment his touch turned from comfort into a weapon. It began with a disagreement over something trivial. She had corrected him in front of Claire, her one and only friend, and he felt that old, familiar burn of shame rise in his throat like bile. Later that evening, he had demanded to know why she would do such a thing, why she would make him appear foolish, why she was incapable of simply backing him up. She had attempted to clarify, to insist that was not her intention. He had seized her wrist, not painfully, just with enough pressure to silence her, to stop the explanations, to end the excuses. "I need you to hear me," he had commanded. And she did. She became utterly quiet and perfectly still, and she listened. In that moment, Coffee felt a dark and gratifying sensation swell inside his chest. It was power, but not the kind you earn. It was not the type that comes from being superior or more intelligent or more skilled. It was the cheap kind that you get from making another person afraid. After that instance, it all became simpler. When she returned home too late, he could grip her arm, pull her toward him, and feel the frantic thump of her heart, a fear she disguised as an apology. When she challenged his thinking, he could elevate his voice and see her cringe, knowing she would immediately retreat. When she made him feel insignificant, he could make her feel even smaller. And each time, he convinced himself that she was to blame, that if she would only listen, only show him respect, only cease to make him so furious, he would not be forced to act this way. He would apologize, of course, bring her flowers, make solemn promises, hold her with tenderness, and whisper that he loved her, and it would never happen again, until it did, time after time. And deep in the recesses of his awareness, Kofi knew he was transforming into his father. He understood he was following the very same path that led to prison cells and shattered homes and children who grew up terrified of their own anger. Yet knowing something and being able to stop it were two entirely different things. Tonight had been a breaking point. She had come home late. She offered no reason, sent no message, just entered as if she possessed the right to vanish without his consent. And a wire inside Kofi had just snapped. It was not a loud or theatrical break, just a quiet, final snap. He had her backed into a corner, demanding an explanation, yanking her hair when she attempted to look away. He was determined to make her understand, determined to make her see the damage she was causing him, determined to... The front door had opened, and now Kofi was frozen in his own home, watching a man dressed in black make a phone call that would make him disappear, and he finally grasped the truth his father had learned far too late. Control was never real. It was only ever borrowed time, waiting for someone stronger to come and take it all away. Matteo Lambert had a talent for reading patterns the way most people read words on a page. A single missed call, a small delay in an email reply, a credit card charge at an odd hour in an unfamiliar place. To most observers, it was just random information. Matteo, however, saw entire narratives written in these digital traces. These stories revealed everything he needed to know about a person. If they were being deceptive, if they were hiding something, or if they were about to become a threat. It was a unique ability that had kept him alive in a world where placing your trust in someone was a dangerous gamble, and a single error could be your last. It was also the very skill he had used to keep track of his sister for the last 6 years, not in a close or intrusive manner. He had made that promise to himself. Juliet had wanted her freedom, she wanted space, she wanted a life that was not stained by the scent of gun oil and dirty money. He understood her reasons, and he even respected them, but understanding did not mean he would ever abandon her. So Matteo constructed a quiet, passive, almost undetectable system. He set up financial monitoring on accounts she believed were completely private. He had facial recognition systems that sent him alerts if she appeared in certain cities. He flagged specific keywords in databases that spanned over a dozen different countries. He never once intervened, never initiated contact, and never allowed her to discover he was observing her. He simply watched. And for 6 years, the information he gathered told him a steady story. Juliet was managing, she was employed, she was moving around, and she was staying hidden and safe. That all changed 3 months ago. The first irregularity was minor. A joint bank account had been opened in Geneva. This was unusual, but it did not immediately set off alarms. Juliet was allowed to have relationships, allowed to trust a person enough to combine her finances with theirs. Matteo made a note of it. He conducted a background investigation on Kofi Emmanuel Jones and found nothing that was an immediate cause for concern. He had no criminal history aside from one assault charge that had been dismissed. His employment record was standard. There were no red flags in any intelligence files. He archived the information and kept monitoring. The second irregularity appeared 5 weeks later. Juliet's spending habits shifted. She no longer visited her favorite bookshop. She stopped having coffee with her friend Claire on Thursdays. Her grocery bills became smaller, with fewer fresh ingredients. She bought more prepared meals. It was the kind of change that hinted at someone eating by themselves, even when they were supposedly not living alone. This was still not definitive proof of anything wrong. Relationships alter a person's routines. That was perfectly normal. But Matteo had learned a long, long time ago that the words normal and safe were not the same thing. The third irregularity was what made him begin to pack a bag. There was an unauthorized withdrawal from their joint account. 3,200 euros. Juliet's income could not handle that kind of a hit. She had been forced to take money from her emergency fund, the one she started when she was only 14 years old, the one she guarded as if it were her very lifeline. Someone was taking money from her, and she was allowing it to happen. Matteo was sitting in his office in Marseille, a refurbished industrial building with a view of the harbor. It was all glass and steel and carefully planned lines of sight, and he stared at the data flowing across his 3 computer monitors. His second in command, a sharp woman named Enz, was standing in the doorway. "You are going to Geneva," she stated. It was not a question. Tomorrow. Matteo kept his eyes fixed on the screens. "I need you to handle the Italian shipment while I am away, no matter how long that is." Enz stepped further into the room, folding her arms across her chest. She had been with Matteo for 7 years and knew him well enough to see the tension in his posture, to notice the way his jaw would clench when he was fighting to remain logical about something that was intensely personal. "What did you discover?" she asked in a low voice. Matteo displayed a financial chart, pointing out the withdrawal history, the changes in spending, and the geographical information that revealed Juliet's world was becoming smaller, more confined, more predictable. "Someone is isolating her," he said. "It could be normal relationship dynamics. It could be." Matteo shut his laptop. "But Juliet does not do normal. She does careful. She does controlled. She would never let someone get close enough to change her habits this severely unless there was something deeply wrong." Enz observed him for a long, quiet moment. "You have not seen her in 6 years. I am aware that she ran from you, from this entire life. I know. Showing up there now might just push her even farther from you." Matteo stood up, fastening the buttons on his suit jacket with the precise, efficient movements of a person who had trained himself to control every single action. "If I am mistaken, she is free to tell me to go." If I am correct, he did not complete the thought. He did not have to. Matteo landed in Geneva on a Wednesday. He did not go to Juliet's apartment right away. That would have been crossing a boundary. It was a boundary he was not yet prepared to violate, the one that separated protective observation from direct interference. So instead, he watched. He sat in coffee shops across the street from her office building and saw her arrive 15 minutes early and leave precisely on time. She never paused to speak with her colleagues. He tailed her to the supermarket and observed her purchase groceries for a single person, despite the fact that she was supposed to be living with someone. He noticed the way she always kept her head lowered. He saw how she navigated through crowds as if she were actively trying to avoid being seen. He saw how she checked her phone constantly, replying to messages almost instantly, as if she were terrified of the consequences of a delay. None of these things was absolute proof, but all of it was part of a pattern. And Matteo had constructed an entire empire by trusting patterns. On the third day, he finally saw Kofi. The man was waiting just outside Juliet's workplace as her shift was ending. He was tall, with a confident stance, dressed in a casual brown jacket and a burgundy hoodie. He smiled as Juliet came closer, but the smile did not touch his eyes. Matteo watched from the other side of the street as they spoke. He saw Kofi's hand rest on the small of Juliet's back, a possessive, controlling gesture. He saw Juliet's shoulders hunch slightly forward, as if to make herself smaller. He saw Kofi lean in to say something that made Juliet nod her head quickly, consenting to something she very clearly did not want to do. The whole thing lasted for 30 seconds. That one message told Mateo everything he needed to know. His original plan had been to move slowly, to gather more evidence. He wanted to approach Juliet with care, in private, to give her the room to explain, to deny, or to tell him to get lost if she wanted. But that night, inside a hotel room across town, an alert flashed across his screen. It was an emergency flag for a keyword: domestic disturbance. Raised voices. Neighbors had reported the sounds of a physical fight. The address belonged to Juliet's apartment. He was already in his car when the second notification arrived. He was ignoring traffic signals by the third, and when he finally reached her building and took the stairs two at a time, he could hear the stifled sounds of crying and yelling through her door. The moment he forced that door open and saw his sister on her knees, with another man's hand twisted in her hair, Mateo stopped thinking about patterns. He was no longer considering strategy or the consequences. He forgot the promise he made to let Juliet live her own life. All he could see was the 9-year-old girl he once knew, the little girl who would hide behind his office door, the 18-year-old who had run away because she loved him too much to stand by and watch what he was turning into. He saw the sister he had failed, the one he failed to protect by giving her exactly what she had begged for: distance, freedom, and the dangerous illusion that she could ever truly be safe without him. He had been completely wrong. And now, Kofi Jones was about to pay the price for his terrible mistake. The fight had started over absolutely nothing. That is how it always began. It was always some small detail, something that should not have mattered. In a healthy relationship, it would have been a simple conversation, maybe a minor point of disagreement, that they would forget by the next morning. But Kofi and Juliet had not had a healthy relationship for many months. She had been late returning from work, exactly 23 minutes late. The traffic was much worse than usual. A delayed tram, the kind of ordinary delay that happens in any city on a Wednesday evening. She had sent him a text message, she had explained, and she had apologized, even though she had done nothing wrong. But it was not enough for him. Kofi was standing by the door the moment she entered, with his arms crossed over his chest. His face was set in that specific expression she had learned to recognize. It was the look that told her he had spent the last half an hour constructing a case against her inside his head, gathering imaginary proof of crimes she had no idea she had committed. 23 minutes, he said. There was no hello. He did not ask how her day was. He only offered an accusation. "I sent you a message," Juliet said softly, placing her bag down with deliberate care. Everything had to be done carefully now. Every single movement was measured to avoid setting off the storm that was already gathering inside him. The tram was held up. There was an accident. You could have called me. I was still on the tram. I did not want to bother the other passengers. You did not want to speak to me. Kofi moved in closer. That is what you really mean. You did not want to hear my voice. You wanted to be out there doing God knows what without me being able to check on you. A knot of dread tightened in Juliet's chest. The script was painfully familiar. She knew every one of the lines, every pause, and all the ways the situation would escalate regardless of what she said or did. I was not doing anything, she replied. I was at work. Then I came directly home. Just like I always do. Just like always. Kofi let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You have been acting different lately. So distant. It is like you are trying to hide something from me. I am not. Who is he? The question felt like a physical slap across her face. Juliet just stared at him. What? You heard what I said? Kofi was now close enough for her to smell the stale coffee on his breath, close enough to see the vein pulsing at his temple. Who is he? There is no one, Kofi. There has never been anyone else. Do not lie to me. His voice was like the crack of a whip in the small apartment. I see the way that you look at your phone. I see the way you smile at messages that you think I do not see. I see the way you pull away from me when I try to touch you. Because you grab me, Juliet said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Because you hurt me. The silence that came after her words was absolutely deafening. Kofi's expression cycled through a dozen different emotions in just 3 seconds. There was shock, then denial, then rage, then justification. He finally landed on indignation. I hurt you. His voice dropped to a dangerously low tone. I protect you. I take care of you. I try to build a life with you, and this is the thanks I get. You make accusations and you disrespect me. I did not mean. You never mean anything. Kofi's hand clamped around her wrist. It was not tight enough to leave a bruise, not quite yet. It was just hard enough to make his point clear. You just say whatever you can to make me look like the bad guy. Juliet attempted to pull her arm back, but his grip only tightened. Let go of me. Not until you decide to tell me the truth. I am telling you the truth. Her voice was trembling now, a mixture of fear and complete frustration. There is no one else. There is nothing more to tell. Please, just please, what? Kofi yanked her toward him. Please believe your own lies. Please just ignore the fact that you are changing into a person I do not even recognize anymore. You are the one who has changed. The words erupted from Juliet before she could force them back down. You used to be kind to me. You used to actually listen. Now all you do is... His other hand shot out and grabbed a handful of her hair. It was not a gentle act. It was not accidental. It was deliberate. Juliet cried out from the sharp pain and the shock. And then came the awful realization that this was worse than before. This was entirely different. This was the exact moment she had been dreading since the very first time his hand had tightened into a fist. This was the line being permanently crossed. Do not you dare blame me for what you have turned me into, Kofi hissed. His face was only inches from hers, contorted with a rage that had been simmering for weeks, for months, or maybe for his entire life. You did this. Your secrets, your distance, your complete refusal to just be honest with me for once. Juliet's hands came up on instinct, trying to pry his fingers from her hair, trying to shield herself, trying to just breathe through the intense pain that was radiating across her scalp. Kofi, please. Please, what? Please stop caring about you. Please stop trying. Please just let you do whatever you want with no consequences. He pulled on her hair even harder. Juliet stumbled forward, her knees crashing against the hardwood floor. The impact sent a jolt of pain up through her legs. Hot tears streamed down her cheeks, fast and unstoppable. This was it. This was the single moment her entire life had been leading to since the day she had run away from Matteo. She had believed she could escape a world of violence by choosing an ordinary life. She thought she could outrun her past by building a future with a man who had no connection to the criminal world. She had been so wrong. Violence did not need a criminal organization to grow. It thrived just fine inside ordinary apartments with ordinary men who discovered that power felt good when you had none of it anywhere else. Answer me. Kofi's voice was breaking now, the rage and desperation twisting into something ugly and unrecognizable. Tell me what it is you are hiding from me. Nothing, Juliet sobbed. I am not hiding anything from you. But she was. She had been hiding for 6 years, hiding her real name, her history, her brother, and her entire past. It was not because she did not trust Kofi, although it turned out she was right not to, but because for her, invisibility meant survival. And in this moment, that invisibility was shattering into a million pieces. You are lying. Kofi's other hand came up, not shaped like a fist, but as a clear threat. You have always been lying to me. Juliet squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact, waiting for the final escalation of his anger. She was waiting for the moment when bruises became broken bones and his rage became something that could never be taken back. But the blow never landed. Instead, she heard a different sound. A door swinging open. Footsteps that were calm, measured and unhurried, and then a voice that was cold, familiar, and impossible. A voice that made her whole world come to a complete stop. "Is this how you touch my sister?" Juliet's eyes flew open. There, standing in the doorway like a memory made real, was Matteo Lambert. Her brother, her past, her final reckoning. The man she had spent 6 years running away from had just walked into the nightmare she had spent 6 months trying to survive. And Kofi, with his hands still tangled in her hair, still frozen in his rage, had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him. For exactly 3 seconds, no one in the room moved. Kofi's hand remained twisted in Juliet's hair. Her knees were still pressed painfully into the hardwood floor. Matteo stood perfectly still in the doorway, with one hand resting on the knob, his expression as serene as someone who had just entered a quiet library instead of a violent assault in progress. Then, Kofi's mind finally processed the new situation. He let go of Juliet, not with any gentleness, but just releasing her as if she were suddenly unimportant. He straightened up to his full height of 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders. These were the physical traits he had used to intimidate Juliet for months. Against Matteo, they meant absolutely nothing. "Who the hell are you?" Kofi's voice aimed for authority, but it came out sounding closer to confused. "You cannot just walk into my apartment." Matteo closed the door behind him. The soft click it made somehow sounded louder than a slam. "Interesting. The lease says Juliet Lambert. It is a joint tenancy." "Yes, but her name is listed first, so technically, I am walking into my sister's apartment." The word just hung there in the tense air. Sister. Kofi's gaze darted to Juliet, who was still on the floor, one hand gently touching her scalp, where the pain was pulsing in hot waves. She refused to look at him. She would not look at Matteo either. She just stared at the wooden floor as if staying perfectly still could somehow rewind the last few minutes. "Your sister," Kofi repeated the word slowly. His tone made it clear he was trying to figure out if this man was a threat or just an unwelcome complication. "Look, man, I do not know what she might have told you, but this is between her and me. This is a private matter." Matteo tilted his head to one side. The small gesture was almost curious, almost polite. "Private," he said. "Is that the word you use for it when you put your hands on a woman who is half your size and make her beg you to stop?" "I did not. She was not." Kofi's face turned red. "You do not understand what is going on here. She has been lying to me. She has been keeping secrets. I was just trying to get her to be honest with me by grabbing her hair." I lost my temper for a second. It happens. All couples fight. Normal. Matteo took a single step forward. Only one. But the small movement seemed to shrink the entire room. Kofi Emmanuel Jones, born on April 14, 1992, in Accra. You relocated to Geneva 3 years ago, right after your last girlfriend in London obtained a restraining order against you. That charge was ultimately dismissed when she suddenly departed the country. Should I proceed? All the color vanished from Kofi's face. Juliet's head snapped up. Her brother's voice was calm, almost conversational, but she knew that tone. She had heard it once before in that study when she was just 9 years old. It was the tone he used right before men went away forever. "How do you—" Kofi began to ask. "Your current place of employment is Mercier Logistics," Matteo went on as if Kofi had not said a word. "You earn 4,200 euros a month. Your credit score is a 680. You have 14,000 euros of debt across 3 different cards. You took 3,200 euros from Juliet's joint account last Tuesday without her knowledge. You have also missed 4 of your anger management sessions with Dr. Owe. You possess a police record in Ghana for a domestic disturbance in 2018. The charges were dropped after the witness suddenly withdrew her statement, 3 days after a man matching your description was spotted lingering outside her place of work. Each new fact struck him like a physical blow. Kofi's mouth hung open, unable to form words. His hands, the very same hands that had felt so certain of their own power just minutes before, were now trembling by his sides. I have your complete employment history, Matteo stated. Your medical files, your internet search history, the license plate of the vehicle you borrowed last weekend, and the name of the bar you visited on Tuesday night when you told Juliet you were working late. I know the address where your mother lives, the office where your sister works, and the school your nephew attends. Stop. The word escaped Coffee's lips as barely a whisper. Matteo paused his advance. He was now less than 6 feet away, near enough for Coffee to see the utter void of emotion in his eyes. I know everything there is to know about you, Coffee, Matteo said in a low voice. I know every secret you have ever held, every falsehood you have ever told, and every shortcut you have ever taken. I understand you better than you understand yourself. Do you want to know why? Coffee was incapable of speaking. He could hardly draw a breath. Because men like you are my line of work, Matteo went on. Men who believe that power is derived from making other people afraid, who confuse control with real strength, who lay their hands on those who cannot defend themselves and have the audacity to call it love. From her position on the floor, Juliet finally managed to find her voice. Matteo. The name came out fractured and shaking, a desperate plea contained within a single word. Please. The impact was instantaneous. Matteo's intense focus shifted to his sister, and he seemed to truly see her for the first time since he had burst into the apartment. He took in her tear-stained face, the red marks already swelling on her scalp, and the way she held her body, as if it were already broken. His expression remained unchanged, but the very atmosphere around him transformed. It went from chillingly cold to absolutely arctic. When his eyes returned to Coffee, something fundamental in the room had altered. You made a terrible mistake tonight, Matteo said. Matteo's voice turned clinical, each word a precise cut. You made a fundamental error. You laid your hands on an individual under my care. This has now become my problem. I had no idea, Coffee sputtered, his voice faltering. She never told me anything. I did not know who you were. That is correct, Matteo conceded. You did not. That is because Juliet fled from my world 6 years in the past. She completely rebuilt her existence, changed her entire routine, and altered every part of her being to create something normal and secure for herself, something that had no connection to brutality and violence. He let the silence hang in the air. Yet despite all her efforts, she ended up on her knees before a man who believes that harming her is a sign of his own strength. The statement landed on Coffee with the impact of a physical blow. He stumbled back one step, and then another. I apologize, he pleaded, the words now saturated with desperation. I am so sorry. I lost my temper. It will never occur again. I promise you it will not. You are right about that, Matteo confirmed. It will not. He retrieved his phone from his pocket. Coffee tracked the motion with the terrified stillness of a prey animal watching a predator. Matteo placed a call, which was answered on the very first ring. I require a disposal crew, he stated with unnerving calm. One residential extraction. There are no complications. Stop, Coffee's voice fractured. Please, just wait. I am sorry. I will get out. I will leave this instant. I promise I will never get in touch with her again. Please. Matteo concluded the call and slid the device back into his coat. When he next spoke, his tone was deceptively soft. You should have considered the consequences before you seized her by the hair. The strength abandoned Coffee's legs. He did not collapse so much as he slid down the wall, all the resistance draining from his body like liquid from a shattered container. And Juliet, still crumpled on the floor, witnessed the collision of her two realities, with the horrifying knowledge that her life was now irrevocably changed. The team appeared in precisely 11 minutes. There were no sirens, no flashing emergency lights, only two black sport utility vehicles that pulled silently to the curb, demonstrating the quiet competence of men who had performed this task hundreds of times previously. Coffee registered the sound of the engines just before he saw them, His head jerked toward the window, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a creature who finally grasps that there is absolutely no way out. Please, he breathed out again, the word having been stripped of all significance by its constant repetition. Please, I will do whatever you ask. I can vanish. You will not ever have to see me again. I will leave this country. I will do anything. You will follow every instruction you are given, Matteo stated evenly. We begin now. The apartment door swung open. Two men stepped inside, both dressed in dark business suits, both moving with the smooth, silent economy of seasoned professionals. One of them was older, perhaps around 50 years old, with strands of silver in his dark hair. The second man was younger, with the solid build of a prizefighter and a history of conflict written in the scars across his knuckles. Neither man so much as glanced at Juliet. They did not require any instructions. The older man gave a single, brief nod to Matteo. Sir, remove him, Matteo instructed in a low voice. Make it quiet. The neighbors do not need any more disturbance tonight. Acknowledged. Coffee pushed himself away from the wall, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender, as if he were under arrest. Where am I going? What is going to happen to me? That is a matter that rests entirely with you, Matteo cut in. He positioned himself between Coffee and Juliet, a movement that was not protective but instead felt like an act of finality, like closing a book on a story that was over. You will depart from this apartment. You will depart from this city. You will vanish so thoroughly that the name Juliet Lambert will become something your mind can no longer recall. Okay, yes, I am able to do that. The agreement spilled from him in a desperate rush. I will leave this very night. I will go pack right now, and you are not packing a single thing, the younger man interjected. His voice was utterly flat, almost dismissive. You will walk out of here with only the clothes on your back. Everything else is being left behind. The color drained from Coffee's face. My things. My identification. Your possessions will be handled, Matteo assured him. You will be provided with your necessary documents and a sum of money sufficient to establish a new life somewhere very distant from here. In return for this, you will sign legal documents that forfeit any and all claims to this apartment, the shared bank account, and any other asset that connects you to Juliet. You will not ever attempt to contact her again. You will not utter her name. You will not even entertain the thought of returning. And what if I refuse? The question was posed in a hushed, almost theoretical tone. Matteo's calm expression remained unchanged. In that case, we will explore some far less agreeable options. The gravity of that statement descended upon the room like a heavy fog, chilling, quiet, and suffocating. Coffee glanced at the two men now standing on either side of him. He looked at Matteo, who stood with his hands casually in his pockets as if they were merely discussing the forecast. He looked at Juliet, who was now finally watching him from the floor, her expression impossible to decipher. This is not lawful, Coffee said, his voice weak. You are not allowed to just do this. Lawful? A thin, mirthless smile touched Matteo's lips. You dragged my sister by her hair inside her own residence and forced her to plead for mercy. You stole her money and you isolated her from her friends. You spent months systematically tearing down her feeling of security. And you have the nerve to lecture me about what is lawful? He took another step forward. Let me explain what is lawful, Coffee. Lawful is Juliet reporting this to the police, giving a statement, and showing them the contusions on her wrists and the raw patches on her scalp. It is her testifying about the months of torment you put her through. Lawful is you being sentenced to prison for battery, larceny, and stalking. It is your name appearing in the news. It is your family discovering the sort of person you truly are. It is future employers reviewing your criminal record. Matteo paused for effect. What I am presenting you with is an alternative that is better than the law. I am presenting you with anonymity, a chance to vanish before the repercussions of your actions find you. Very few men are ever given such a choice. Coffee's jaw trembled. His gaze darted frantically between the men, the door, and then to Juliet, searching for any possible escape, any loophole, any path that did not lead to his complete and utter capitulation. None existed. "All right," he finally uttered. The word was a shattered, defeated sound. "Okay, I will leave. I will sign anything you put in front of me. Just, please do not harm me." "That is up to you," Matteo said again. "My associates will escort you to a secure location. You will sign the necessary papers. You will give us the details we require to confirm that you remain gone permanently. If you are compliant, you will depart with enough funds to begin again and a harsh lesson about the consequences of harming the wrong person. And if I am not compliant?" The life drained from Matteo's eyes. "Then you will be made into an object lesson for others." The older man stepped forward, placing a hand on Coffee's shoulder. The gesture was not aggressive, merely firm and directive. "It is time to go." Coffee allowed himself to be guided to the door, moving with the detached motion of someone in a trance. The defiance had been entirely purged from him, leaving only a hollow sense of submission. At the doorway, he paused and glanced back for a final time. "Juliet, I—" "Do not." Matteo's voice sliced through whatever plea or excuse Coffee was about to offer. "Do not speak her name. Do not look in her direction. Do not even allow her to enter your thoughts. You forfeited that privilege the instant you confused brutality with affection." Coffee's mouth snapped shut. His entire frame seemed to deflate. And then he was led out. The door clicked closed behind him. The echo of their footsteps receded down the corridor, and the building settled back into deep silence. For a considerable time, neither Matteo nor Juliet stirred. The apartment suddenly felt vast and vacant, an emptiness that stemmed not from Coffee's departure, but from the immense emotional weight of the events that had just unfolded. At last, Matteo walked across the room. He moved without haste, without any theatrical display of solicitude. He simply moved with a quiet sense of purpose until he was kneeling before his sister. He met her gaze at eye level, not as a superior to a subordinate, nor a rescuer to a casualty, but simply as a brother to his sister. "Juliet," he said, his voice gentle. She looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time in 6 long years. He was older now, with harder lines etched into his features. The young man who once read her stories at bedtime was entirely gone, supplanted by someone more formidable and efficient. Yet his eyes were the same. And as he raised a hand, slowly and deliberately, as if asking for permission to touch her, she recognized a glimmer of the brother she had once fled from, the brother whose memory she had never ceased to cherish, the brother from whom she could never truly escape. "I am sorry," Matteo said. The 2 words were spoken quietly, filled with genuine regret. "I am sorry that I did not get here sooner." Juliet's composure shattered. 6 years of flight, 6 months of endurance, 6 minutes of watching her past violently crash into her present. The cumulative weight of it all descended upon her at once. She pitched forward into her brother's embrace and finally, at long last, permitted herself to fall apart. And Matteo, a man who had constructed an entire empire on the principle of never revealing weakness, never conceding error, and never allowing anyone near enough to inflict pain, simply held his sister tightly. He made a silent vow that no one would ever make her feel so powerless again. Regardless of the cost, regardless of who needed to be erased, no one. The room where Coffee was brought was not what he had envisioned. There was no dungeon, no restraints, no grim torture device from a film where criminals had their fingers broken to extract information. It was merely an office, sterile, contemporary, and starkly minimalist in design. The room was decorated in a style that spoke of significant wealth. Immense windows stretched from the floor to the ceiling, offering a panoramic view of Geneva's lights spread out below. A dark mahogany desk dominated the space, accompanied by leather chairs and abstract art on the walls that surely cost more than Coffee's annual salary. This felt like a place where serious business was conducted, a fact that was somehow more frightening than any dungeon he could imagine. The two men who had brought him here, an older one with graying hair and a younger one with scarred hands, guided him into a chair that faced the desk. They were not forceful. They had no need to be. Coffee's own legs had abandoned any notion of escape. The older man simply said, "Wait here," before they both departed. The door shut with a gentle click, a sound identical to the one in Juliet's apartment that had sealed his doom. Coffee sat there completely alone, struggling to draw a breath. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His heart pounded against his ribcage as if it were trying to break free. Every terrifying story he had ever heard about organized crime rushed into his thoughts. People vanishing without a trace, feet encased in concrete, bodies that were never found. Could this be how his life ended? Not in some dramatic, violent showdown, but in a pristine office with costly art and a final view of a city he would never walk in again. The door opened and Matteo entered. He had taken off his coat and pushed up the sleeves of his shirt. This simple action revealed forearms covered in intricate ink, designs that seemed less like tattoos and more like a secret language Coffee could never comprehend. Matteo sat down behind the grand desk, but did not speak right away. Instead, he opened a laptop, typed for a moment, and then examined the screen with the casual disinterest of someone checking a shopping list. Coffee could only wait, drenched in a cold sweat, paralyzed by terror. At last, Matteo raised his eyes. "Do you have any idea why you are still breathing?" he asked in a calm, conversational tone. Coffee's throat felt tight. He could only manage to shake his head no. "It is because killing you would greatly upset my sister," Matteo stated plainly. "Juliet has invested 6 years of her life building an existence that is free from violence. She fled from my world for the specific purpose of avoiding situations like this one." He made a slight gesture that took in the office, himself, and the entire predicament. "And frankly, I would rather not confirm her deepest fears about who I am by murdering her abusive boyfriend within the first hour of us seeing each other again." He let that sink in. "So for now, you will continue to live. Congratulations." That word should have brought a wave of relief. Instead, it felt like another kind of threat. "Thank you," Coffee managed to whisper. "Do not thank me yet." Matteo rotated the laptop to face him. A document filled the screen. It was pages of dense, legal language. "This is a legal agreement. You will be signing it. Do you have any idea what it contains?" Coffee stared at the screen, but the words were a meaningless blur. "No. It states that you are transferring full ownership of the apartment to Juliet. It states that you are forfeiting any access to your shared bank account. It also states that you are agreeing to a restraining order that is valid not just in Geneva, but across all of Switzerland, France, and Italy. It specifies that if you are ever seen within 500 meters of my sister again, then all of our agreements are void." Matteo scrolled further down the page. "It also includes a clause where you surrender any right to pursue legal action against me, my employees, or anyone else involved in this evening's events. You will be acknowledging that you departed on your own accord, that no illegal act took place, and that you have no reason to involve the authorities." "And what if I refuse to sign?" A smile touched Matteo's lips, but it was cold and did not reach his eyes. "Then you and I will have a very different kind of discussion. A discussion that will include the proof I have of your theft, your physical assault, and that restraining order from London you violated 2 times before the woman was forced to flee the country. It will be a discussion that involves me contacting your employer, your family, and the police. A discussion that ensures every single person you know finds out precisely the sort of man you truly are." He leaned closer. "I can utterly ruin you through legal channels, Coffee, and I can do it in public. I can make certain you never find work again, never rent a property again, and never go on a date again without that woman discovering your name through a simple online search and finding endless pages detailing your history of abuse. I can accomplish all of that without ever physically harming you." The unspoken threat filled the room. "Or," Matteo went on, "you can simply sign the document. You can take the money I am offering, which is enough to cover 6 months of living costs somewhere very distant from here. You can disappear from our lives quietly. You can start a new life. And you can learn a valuable lesson from this experience." Coffee's hands were shaking violently as he picked up the pen from the desk. "Where do I need to sign?" 20 minutes passed. Every single page had been initialed. Every condition had been accepted. Every connection had been severed. Matteo pushed a thick envelope across the polished desk. 10,000 euros in cash. That amount is not negotiable. Do not attempt to ask for more. Coffee accepted it with his trembling hands. "There is a train departing for Milan in 2 hours," Matteo informed him. "My men will provide you with a ride to the station. You will board that train. You will never try to contact Juliet again. You will never say her name out loud. You will never share the story of what happened tonight. Is that understood?" "Yes." "And do you understand the consequences if you violate this agreement?" Coffee nodded his head. He understood with perfect clarity. Matteo rose to his feet and buttoned his cuffs with sharp, efficient motions. "You made a critical decision tonight, Coffee. You made the choice to lay your hands on a person you believed was completely helpless. Someone you assumed had no one to protect her. Someone you thought you could injure without any repercussions." He circled the desk and came to a stop directly in front of Coffee's chair. "You were mistaken on all 3 points. Juliet is not helpless. She has never been without protection, and every action has its consequences." Matteo's voice became a low, menacing whisper. "The singular reason you are walking out of this building tonight is that my sister asked me to make it stop. It is not because you are worthy of mercy. It is not because you have somehow earned forgiveness, but because she whispered my name, and it reminded me that she ran from this world to escape this exact type of brutality." He stood up straight. "Therefore, I am granting her wish. A clean break. No violence, no body, just your complete absence from her life." Coffee got to his feet on unsteady legs. The envelope of cash felt incredibly heavy in his grasp. "But if you ever, and I mean ever, go near her again," Matteo's voice was unyielding, "her wishes are now irrelevant. I will only recall your actions. And if there is a next time we speak, it will not conclude with money and a ticket for a train. Is that perfectly clear?" Coffee managed a weak yes. "Say the words," Matteo commanded. "I understand," Coffee finally said, his voice cracking with fear. "I will never try to see her again. I will never return. I promise you." Matteo observed him for a long, silent moment before giving a single, sharp nod. "Good." He touched a button on his desk, and the office door swung open. The two men reappeared. "Take this man to Cornavin station," Matteo instructed. "Ensure he boards the train to Milan. After that, he is no longer our concern." The older of the two men acknowledged the order. "Understood." They positioned themselves on either side of Coffee, steering him towards the exit. Just before leaving, Coffee hesitated and looked back. In a quiet voice, he said, "For whatever it is worth, I truly did love her. In the beginning." Matteo's face remained a mask of stone. "Love does not lay hands on another person," he replied. "What you experienced was a feeling of ownership. And ownership is not love. It is just control with a more appealing sales pitch." Coffee had no answer for that. He turned and left. The door clicked shut. The lock engaged, leaving Matteo by himself in the quiet of his office. He gazed out at the twinkling city lights. His thoughts were consumed by his sister, crying in her apartment 40 minutes from here. He thought about the 6 years she had spent on the run, and the vow he made to himself when she was just 9 years old, hiding from the world behind his office door. He had let her down back then, by allowing her to witness the man he truly was. He had let her down a second time by granting her the distance she had requested. He would not fail her a third time. No matter the effort, no matter the price, nobody would ever harm Juliet Lambert again. Juliet had no idea how long she wept. Time lost all meaning the second Matteo came into her apartment. The minutes and hours melted away. They merged into a single, unending moment where the only thing that felt real was her brother's arms holding her. He held her with such deliberate care, as if she might completely break apart if he were to let go. At last, the flow of tears subsided. It was not because the hurt was gone, but simply because her body had no more ways to show it. She began to pull away from him, ever so slowly. Matteo released her right away. He did not hold on. He did not try to force a comfort she was not prepared to accept. He simply created space for her and remained patient. Juliet's eyes scanned the apartment. Nothing had physically changed. The furniture was the same. The curtains were the same. The same shattered glass still littered the floor from where coffee had smashed the mirror the previous week. Yet everything felt profoundly different. The very air felt changed. The deep silence felt new. She felt like a different person. He is gone. Her voice sounded harsh and damaged from all the crying. Yes. Where did he go? To Milan, for now. After that, he will go wherever he chooses to hide. Matteo got to his feet and walked to the kitchen. He came back with a glass of water for her, placing it on the coffee table so she could easily reach it. He signed documents that transfer this apartment to you. He also agreed to a restraining order that is valid in 3 separate countries. He accepted money, a train ticket, and a very vivid explanation of what would happen to him if he ever came back. Juliet reached for the water. Her hand trembled just a little, a sense of being lost. You did not hurt him. She stated it as a fact, not as a question, but Matteo responded all the same. No, I did not. Because you specifically asked me not to. She took a small sip of water. It was cold and clean. It was exactly the thing she needed, but something she would not have been able to ask for herself. Thank you, she whispered. Matteo took a seat in the armchair that was across from her. He did not sit on the couch beside her. That might have felt like a form of pressure. She looked at him with sudden clarity. No, your kind of violence is born from strength, from maintaining control. It comes from building your empires and defending your territory. Coffee's violence was born from his weakness and from his deep insecurity. He hated himself so profoundly that he needed to make me feel smaller just so he could feel bigger. She took a breath. They are not the same thing at all. Matteo thought about her words for a moment. But they both caused you pain. Yes, she agreed. But I only chose to run away from one of them. Her words hung in the space between them like heavy weights. For what felt like a long time, neither of them said anything. Then Matteo leaned forward in his chair. He rested his elbows on his knees and clasped his hands together. What is it that you want, Juliet? Not what you believe I want you to say. Not what you think is the right thing to want. What do you truly, honestly want? The question was so direct and simple that it completely broke her. Because for 6 long years, Juliet had known precisely what she wanted. She wanted freedom. She wanted to be anonymous. She wanted a normal life. And she wanted safety. And she had managed to get 3 of those 4 things. She built a peaceful existence in a peaceful city, with a peaceful job and predictable routines. But none of it had been enough to protect her. I do not know, she finally confessed. I thought I did, she continued. I truly believed that if I could just remain unseen enough, cautious enough, and small enough, then I could steer clear of this. I could avoid you. I could avoid everything that is connected to the Lambert family name. You did avoid me, he pointed out, and see where that has left you. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. On my knees inside my own apartment, with a man's hand tangled in my hair, right before my brother walks in looking like some kind of avenging spirit. I am no angel. I am aware of what you are, Matteo. Juliet's voice took on a harder edge. I have always been aware. I spent my childhood observing, listening, and learning to understand exactly what it means to be a Lambert. That is the very reason I left. And now, I am just so tired. The admission came out as a quiet, defeated whisper. I am tired of running away. I am tired of hiding myself. I am tired of trying to build a normal life when that normal always dissolves into a nightmare. And then she met his gaze directly. I am tired of being afraid. Matteo's stoic expression did not shift, but there was a definite change in his eyes, a flicker of acknowledgement, a kind of understanding that went far beyond what mere words could express. You do not have to live in fear any longer, he said, because you are going to protect me. Yes, he confirmed, by making people vanish if that is what it takes. Juliet hugged her arms tightly around herself. That is not freedom, Matteo. That is just a different style of cage. Perhaps, he conceded. He did not try to argue the point or convince her that she was wrong. But it is a cage where nobody can harm you, where nobody would even dare to try, and where your name itself is all you need to stay safe. My name, Juliet echoed. Lambert, the name I have spent the last 6 years trying to bury. It has always belonged to you. You only tried to make yourself forget it. I tried to get away from it. And did that work for you? The question remained in the air between them. Juliet thought about her apartment, her job, her careful, quiet routines. She thought of her friendship with Claire, a friendship she had thrown away the instant coffee told her to. The entire life she had constructed had turned to dust the moment someone decided to test its strength. No, she admitted at last. It did not work. Matteo nodded his head, as if he had known all along what her answer would be. I am not asking you to return to my world, he said, choosing his words with care. I am not asking you to come work for me, or to stand by my side in business meetings, or to become a part of the family empire. You made your decision 6 years ago, and I have always respected that choice. But I am no longer going to let you face this world by yourself. His tone was solid. It was absolute. You can continue to live in this apartment. You can keep your job. You can keep building whatever kind of life you wish to have. But you will do it with my protection, with my resources, and with the full knowledge that any person who lays a hand on you will have to answer to me. That is still a form of control. It is insurance. That sounds exactly like something my father used to say. Matteo flinched. It was a very slight reaction, but just enough for Juliet to see it. Our father, he said in a low voice, constructed an empire by making everyone afraid of him. I keep it running by making sure people are smart. There is a very real difference. Is there? Juliet challenged. Coffee is alive. He is leaving the country with money and a chance at a future. Our father would have had him buried somewhere in a vineyard. Juliet knew she could not argue against that. She had witnessed what their father was capable of doing. She had seen the aftermath, heard the terrible sounds, and observed the casual cruelty of a man who was convinced that showing mercy was a sign of weakness. Matteo was a great many things, but he was certainly not their father. What happens if I say no? She asked him. What if I ask you to leave right now, to go all the way back to Marseille and just forget that you ever located me? Matteo held her gaze. Then I will leave, and I will go back to watching over you from a distance, and I will pray that if something happens again, I will notice the signs of danger much sooner. There is not going to be a next time. You cannot guarantee that. And neither can you. No, Matteo conceded, but I can make it significantly less probable. Juliet looked at her brother. She saw the man who had once read her stories before bed, the man who had built a criminal empire, and the man who had walked through her door at the precise moment to rescue her from a situation she could not escape on her own. She thought about 6 years of being on the run, 6 months of just trying to survive, and 6 minutes of watching her two separate worlds collide. And then, she made a decision. It was not the same choice she had made when she was 18. It was not a choice born from fear. Okay, she said, her voice soft. Matteo lifted one eyebrow. Okay? Okay. I will accept your protection, and your resources, and whatever else is needed to keep me safe. But my life remains my own. My apartment and my independence are mine. I am not becoming a piece of your world. I am simply acknowledging that your world is real. That is everything I am asking for. And Matteo, she added, if you ever deceive me about what you are doing to protect me, if you ever make me an unknowing party to violence, I will run away again. And the next time, you will never be able to find me. He considered her terms for a moment, then gave a single nod. Fair. This was not a perfect solution. It was not a path to healing. But it was a start. And there are times when a beginning is more than enough. Matteo remained until the sun came up. He did not hover over her or ask a lot of questions. He was simply there. He swept up the shards of broken glass while Juliet sat on her sofa, wrapped up in a blanket, and stared blankly into space. He did not ask if she wanted help, and he did not wait for her to give him permission. He just moved around the apartment with a silent competence, cleaning away the physical proof of what had occurred while the emotional damage was still so fresh and raw. At some point during the night, Juliet drifted off. It was not true sleep. It was just deep exhaustion that pulled her down for a few minutes at a time, until a sudden noise or a painful memory would jolt her back into awareness. When she finally opened her eyes for good, she saw the apartment was tidy. The glass was gone, the furniture had been put back in its proper place, and the shattered mirror was now covered by a sheet, a temporary measure until it could be properly taken away and replaced. Matteo was sitting in the armchair across from her. He had his jacket back on. He looked as if he had not just spent the entire night cleaning up the chaotic ruins of his little sister's life. What time is it? Juliet's voice was raspy. 6:30. The early morning light was filtering in through the curtains. It was a soft gray light, the kind that makes everything in the world seem uncertain and temporary. You should probably go, Juliet told him. You have a whole empire that needs running. The empire can wait for me, Matteo replied. I am not leaving this apartment until we discuss what is going to happen next. Juliet pulled the blanket around herself more tightly. I thought we already took care of that. We discussed protection, he clarified. We have not yet discussed healing. The question was a heavy weight. Juliet had been pushing it away, refusing to think about what happens after you survive. What comes next, now that coffee was gone? Matteo was here, and she was left with 6 months of deep trauma and no idea what to do next. I do not know how to recover from this, she confessed, her voice small. Neither do I. The frankness of Matteo's reply caught her off guard. I am skilled at neutralizing threats, at safeguarding assets, and at making difficult problems vanish. But when it comes to helping you truly heal from what he did to you, I admit I have no idea where to even begin. Then why are you still here with me? Because you are my sister, he said simply, and I do not need to have all the answers to know that I am not going to leave you to face this by yourself. Juliet felt the sting of fresh tears in her eyes. She was so exhausted from crying, exhausted from feeling so weak, exhausted from depending on other people. I need help, she whispered. Real help, like therapy or something. I will see to it. No, not one of your associates. I need someone who is independent, someone who has no connection to your world at all. Matteo nodded in understanding. I know a person. A doctor who is based in Zurich. She specializes in working with survivors of trauma. She is entirely a civilian. She has helped people in the past, people who have escaped from violent relationships. I can arrange an introduction for you, if you would like. You know a trauma therapist? I know a great many people, Juliet, and not every single one of them is a criminal. In spite of everything that had happened, Juliet almost broke into a smile. Okay, yes, please do that. It is done. The silence that fell between them afterward was not awkward, but it was filled with all the things they did not know how to articulate. Eventually, Matteo stood up. I must return to Marseille tonight, but I am assigning 2 of my people to stay here for your security. They will be discreet. You will not notice them unless you require their help, but they will always be nearby. I do not want bodyguards. That is not negotiable. His tone was firm and left no room for debate. After what occurred, I am not willing to take any risks. Just try it for 1 month. If you still despise it, then we can discuss it again. Juliet had the urge to argue, to insist that she did not need anyone watching over her. But the honest truth was, she was deeply afraid. She was terrified that Coffee might come back. She was terrified a worse monster would find her. She was terrified because being alone meant she was a target. She had agreed to 1 month of his protection. Just 1 month. Matteo walked to the exit, paused, and looked back at her. Juliet, you said something earlier about running from violence, not from me. I remember that. I need you to understand something. He hesitated, searching for the right words. I built all of this because I believed power could keep people safe. I thought if I had enough control, enough strength, and made others afraid, then nothing could ever harm the people I cared for. His jaw clenched. But that was a lie. Control is not protection. It is only the fantasy of it. And while I was chasing that fantasy, I turned into the very thing you had to escape. Juliet rose slowly from her seat. The blanket fell away from her shoulders. You also turned into the man who saved my life tonight. That is because I was always watching. Because I never truly let you go. I know that. Does knowing that make you angry? Juliet considered the question. She gave it real thought. 6 years ago, she would have screamed yes. The constant surveillance, the feeling of being watched, the fact she could never truly vanish, it all would have felt like a cage. But now she understood that some kinds of love could not survive by letting go. No, she finally answered. It makes me feel grateful, and sad, and deeply confused. But I am not angry. Matteo gave a slow nod. He was familiar with complicated feelings. His entire world was built upon them. I am going to make you a promise, he said. And I need you to trust me. Can you do that? No one will hurt you again. Ever. His voice was a low whisper, but it was absolute. Not like this. Not as long as I am breathing. I do not care who they are, what they are after, or what reason they think they have. Anyone who lays a hand on you, anyone who makes you feel afraid, anyone who dares to think you are weak, they will discover just how terribly wrong they are. A knot formed in Juliet's throat. That is a very dangerous promise to make, Matteo. I am a very dangerous man. I know. And you are still my little sister. You are still the girl who would hide behind the door to my office. You are still the one person in this world for whom I would burn everything to the ground just to protect. He stepped toward her, stopping just out of arm's reach. Juliet, I am not blind to what I am. I know about the things I have done, the people I have hurt, and the lines I have crossed. But every single action was meant to keep my family safe. And with you, I failed. I let you go because I thought you would be safer far away from me than you were by my side. I was mistaken. You were not mistaken, Juliet replied. I had to run. I had to see if I could make it on my own. I needed to learn if I could survive without your shadow hanging over me. And I did. I know now that I can survive. But I also know that I no longer have to do it by myself. A small, real smile touched Matteo's lips. No, he confirmed. You do not. He retrieved a card from his jacket and placed it on the table. This is my personal number. It does not go to my office. It does not go through my assistants. It comes directly to me. You use that number for any reason, at any time, and I will be the one who answers. Juliet lifted the small white card. It held only a string of numbers. Thank you. Do not thank me just yet. We still need to learn how to be a brother and sister again after 6 years have passed. It will likely be complicated, but we will find a way. Yes, we will. Matteo went to the door again, placing his hand on the handle before stopping a final time. Juliet, I love you. I know I do not say it nearly enough. I do not know how to show you without making it feel like control, but the feeling is real. I love you too. Juliet's voice trembled. And just like that, he was gone, the door clicking softly shut behind him. The apartment became profoundly quiet. And in that quiet, Juliet Lambert stood in the soft morning light, a blanket around her shoulders and her brother's phone number in her hand. And for the first time, she truly let herself believe that healing was possible. Not by herself, not in the shadows, but with the very protection she had spent 6 years running from, and the love she had never really been without. Blood knew its own. And sometimes, that knowledge was a form of mercy. Thank you for following this story all the way to its conclusion. You are what makes these narratives feel real. If you are prepared for another emotional journey, simply tap on the next video you see on your screen. Here is what this story wants you to remember. Silence is not safety. Juliet spent 6 years perfecting the art of being invisible, believing that if she disappeared completely, violence could never find her again. But the truth is, abuse does not need a criminal empire to survive. It grows in ordinary homes, behind ordinary doors, with ordinary men who discover that fear is the cheapest form of power. And here is the other side of that truth. Love is not possession, but it is not abandonment either. Matteo watched from the shadows for 6 years because he understood that letting go and giving up are not the same thing. Sometimes, the people who love you most are the ones who stay close enough to catch you when the world you built on your own comes crashing down. If you are making yourself smaller to keep someone else calm, that is not a relationship. That is a prison, and you deserve better. If this story stirred something deep inside you, please take 1 second to hit that like button. It costs you nothing, but it helps this channel more than you know. Drop a comment below and tell me, what moment in this story shook you the most? I read every single comment, and I truly love hearing from you. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. Tap that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And if someone in your life needs to hear this message today, share this video with them. One click could be the thing that changes everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and real value to our audience.